You with me? All right, guys. So last week we talked about, sorry to go through slides like that, exception planning and error planning. Tonight we're going to go through some tools, some really common tools in Studio. Some you may be using, some you may not have heard of, some you may not be using to the fullest potential of that tool. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to try and focus on all these. We may not get to all of them tonight. And if we don't, we have one more session in this series, I think next Monday on debugging and alpha testing. We'll try and cover them off. One of the most important tools you'll be using as you build your automations is a try catch. That you're going to try a process, you're going to try an execution of some steps. And if that fails or anything fails within that, you're going to catch an error. And you're going to be able to tell the bot what to do if it catches the error. And pretty much I'm going to put, when I build, I put almost everything in a try catch at some point, because it's one of the most robust and one of the easiest error exception handling you can employ. We're going to talk about element exists that we use with an if-else statement. Element exists would be something in a browser or an application window, and you're looking for an element that remains on every page statically, regardless of an update to the application. You're always going to find an element, in most cases, I should say. On element appear and vanish, that's another tool that we can use in error processing and error exception handling, I should say. Get attribute, anchoring. Anchoring is going to come into play on selectors, especially if you have some fuzzy selectors that you can anchor to a title page. You can anchor to a common icon on your page. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do some robust selectors. I hear all the time, and I teach like you all heard me last week say. I teach this to high school students. I teach this to college students. I teach this to citizen developers. I teach this for UiPath, and I always have the question: well, the selector worked last time, and for some reason it's not working today. I'll give you an example. So I told you last week that the bots that we have here at my organization, they all have maintenance. They have self-maintenance. So we call it taking a shower. They take a shower 3 times a day. And part of that process is they go into, if you've ever worked with Outlook, you know that a bot can't necessarily send an email on its own behalf because it's in a server. So we have to go in there and make sure the programmatic access is set correct for that. And the bots check that themselves. Over the weekend, Microsoft changed one part of the selector on the options that the bot had to go into, and all my bots weren't able to take a full bath. And we had that in a try catch, so it notified me that, hey, something's different. So we're going to talk about robust selectors. And even as robust as you make your selector, if you're using anchoring, you're using element exists, something's going to change because you don't own the systems. You don't own O365. You don't own some of the third-party systems. So something's always going to change. Like I said last time, your automation is going to fall at some point. We're going to talk about using a logging, a should stop. If you all are using Orchestrator, you should always have, if you work for me at least, or in my COE, you will always have a should stop inside your for each loops. A should stop is somewhere where you can go into Orchestrator, you can tell Orchestrator to stop the process gracefully and not mess up your whole transaction items, okay? So we're going to talk about should stops. You should make that you should make a should stop part of your for each loops if you're running your automations through Orchestrator. It's good practice. Wait for download. We'll talk about how you can wait for your download to complete instead of putting in, let's say you have a large file coming out of SAP and you've tested the download speeds of that file several different times. You know you have some peak periods towards the end of the month or towards the end of the year, quarter, whatever it might be. And sometimes the downloads take longer. So instead of putting in a delay for 10 minutes or 5 minutes waiting for a download to process out of an ERP system, you can use a wait for download. Navigate to, we use Navigate to when we're clicking, and like you all know, I don't like clicky bots, but when we're forced to use a clicky bot, we use Navigate tos instead of clicking on buttons and hyperlinks. We just Navigate to if that URL is going to be static and redefinable, and it's definable every time. If you go into an application, we're going to use the UiPath website to kind of show you this stuff today. Set focus is a tool in Studio that we can use to have the keyboard, the bot's keyboard, find the same thing every time. Whether if it's on screen, you can set the focus to find that on the screen. And that's going to help you prevent if a UI element on your screen changes, or the look of your screen changes, or your interface changes, setting focus on that element that you need every time is going to help the bot find that every time. And then we're going to talk about Retry Scope. If we get into it, we can talk about throws, throwing an error, things like that. I don't typically use a rethrow unless I'm doing some debugging, but I will use a lot of throws. All right, so let's get into a try catch. And I'm going to switch my screen over here. So bear with me. You should be able to see a Studio screen. So let's go a try catch. A simple thing, you can find it in your activities panel. I tend to use the little button here and just go try catch and get everything I can. I don't typically drop and drag from over here. Let's just do a log message in here. Let's see. Bear with me. And I'm just going to say something along the lines of, I'm going to attempt to write something. How's that? Okay, a try catch. Not everything, and I'm sure those of you who are developers or have developed, and I don't know to what extent the skill level is, not everything that you think the bot encounters is going to be easily recognizable by the bot as an exception. System exceptions can be you're not finding your selector, things like that. You can have an argument exception. You can have an in-out, an IO file exception. You can have, when you're working with Excel, there's any number of different exceptions you can have with Excel. If you were to leave your catch as simply a system exception, you're going to miss some exceptions that you're going to encounter, or your bot's going to encounter. And the easiest way to learn what exceptions your automation encounters is you need to do some debugging. And I always tell the people that develop for my organization that I want you to break your automation so that you can see what the bot's going to encounter if something breaks. We don't build and then just put into UAT. We build, we break it, and then we rebuild it, and we break it if we need to again, just so we know any possible thing the bot's going to encounter. And we talk about that with our business teams when they do UAT, is we want you to break the bot. And they will try their best to break the bot. And that's the only way your bot, you're going to be able to make your automation as robust as possible. There will, like I said, there will always be something that will cause a fault with your bot. But if you get your business team and your developers in the practice of breaking your bot, even your BA, if you have a business analyst on the front end working through this with the business team, and he's coming, or she's coming up with some testing scripts or testing scenarios, have that person also come up with some testing scripts and testing scenarios that will break that automation, okay? Because as you run into those exceptions, you're going to find the different exceptions that your bot can encounter, whether it's a .com exception or whether it's a argument exception, things like that. So let's talk about some of those. So you have a list, default list of system argument exception. Let's say, for example, you have a tab in an Excel spreadsheet, and you have that tab name brought into your automation through some sort of argument. And let's face it, people fat finger. Accidentally, people do it, I do it. And if they've changed the name of that tab at any point, your argument's no longer going to be valid. Your bot's going to throw a system argument exception. A null reference exception. Let's say you have a database, a data table, or a data set that you're ingesting into your automation. And typically, the system that it's coming out of has taken out a cell and on 2 or 3 rows, everything's moved over 2 spaces and there's a blank row there, a blank cell. You're going to get a system no reference exception. Nothing there for me to read, guys. It's a no reference exception. In-out exception, your file's not there. Okay, you're looking for a file, you're looking for a zip file, or even if you have a, if you've ever worked Microsoft Explorer on your system, and you've got some junk files, and you don't always see what we call Excel junk in our world, or you have some files that are temp files and you don't see those because your organization may have those set to be hidden from you. If you cannot unhide those, you may run into an IO exception. You're looking for a certain file in that, and the bot's going down through this list of files. It's processing each file, then it runs into this temp file that you can't see is there, and it can't process because it's not in a regular file format. You're going to get an IO exception. Excuse me, invalid operation exception. And then you'll have some things called, if we go for browse for types, we could have a selector not found exception. Okay. That would be an exception where in your UI, the bot can't find the selector. Okay. As you notice, that's not part of the default that you had earlier. Selector not found exception was not part of this default, right? You need to go find it and you need to bring it into your automation. You may run into, this is one of my favorites because UiPath has this hidden. Well, let's just call it Excel. Sorry guys, I'm blind. You have an Excel exception that's unique to UiPath, okay? An Excel exception would be something, let's say you're working with a file from 97, I think it's 97 to 2003 or whatever, it's .xls instead of .xlsx. You're going to run into a UiPath Excel exception, okay? So whenever you're working with an Excel file, you'll want to bring in the UiPath Excel exception within your automation. A system IO exception, like I said, would be a file exception. Let's say we're looking for a COM exception. Okay, a COM exception, your bot cannot communicate with whatever you're having the bot do. Either it's lost connection somewhere, you're using the AWS cloud, you're using the UiPath cloud, and there's been a collapse in the tunnel. Somewhere, somehow, you have a communications exception, okay? I always bring a COM exception into mostly everything I do. And if I'm using a UI, if I'm not using an API, if I'm using a UI, because I want my bot to know that if you disconnect or that system disconnects, I want you to be able to handle that exception. Thinking of some other ones. I usually pull in so many exceptions, especially when I'm working with Excel files. I will pull in a whole slew of exceptions because I want to make sure my bot knows what it's doing. And when I do those exceptions, I will first identify those in my file. Let me pull one up. Let me see if I can find one that's not proprietary. Quick, I'll give you an example. So give me 2 seconds. And let me pull up a RE framework template that we have saved. It'll take a minute to open it. Now, excuse my sniffles, guys. I live in Texas and Texans are allergic to absolutely everything. Let's open this guy. Let's move. All right. I track my exceptions, and you don't need to do this. This is just what I do. So in here, I may have, let me see if I have. Okay, so here's my initial applications. These are some common exceptions that I've encountered when I've worked with system applications or browsers or something like that. I'll have a plain system exception, okay? I'll have a selector not found exception, timeout exception. That means if your bot is spinning, you've got a lot of latency in your system, your bot's going to encounter a system timeout. If you've ever gone to your bank site and you get distracted, your bank sends you a message saying, hey, you've exceeded your time, we're going to log you out. That's a timeout exception. No reference and argument exception. If we get into where we're reading Excel, I don't have one in this guy. When I start to read Excel, I'll have a lot more exceptions in an Excel file than that. But you can see that I pull in all kinds of exceptions. And what I do in my world, I track, as part of our KPIs, we track the kind of exceptions that our bots encounter. And we do this, number one, for our IT department to understand what kind of things the bot's encountering that we can possibly prevent in the future and make our RPA COE run a little bit smoother, because we are a larger COE and we deal with about, I guess, 3,000 stores. So we have a lot of store-facing automations. So we want to make sure that there's no interruption in what the stores encounter when they're working with our bots. So we track our exceptions. So you can see here, I will name my exceptions down here in a variable so we can track what kind of browser exception we had, what happened in here, so we can keep track of those. And then I will reassign those to a system exception, because that system exception is going to be what's going to carry the bot to my end state, right? Because if you look in here, browser exception is not nothing. That's because it's a system exception, and it's going to go to my end state. If I just left it as a browser exception, it's not going to do that. It's from the initialization state. And so I will do my try catches, and you can see everything's in a try catch. Everything I do is in a try catch. So you want to make sure that as you're debugging, you're testing, or you're running it on your studio, your developer machine, and you get the little red flash up. You want to go through that stack, that error stack, and find out specifically what that exception is. And you can look it up on the Academy. Someone will tell you this is what that exception means. Not the Academy, maybe the forum. You can ask any seasoned developer, and we'll be able to tell you what that exception means. And if you've encountered it once in your automation, then more than likely you're going to encounter it again, and you'll want to incorporate that into your try catch. So the second part of the try catch, after you've done your try and you've done these catches, you're going to tell the bot what to do if in case it encounters those catches. In my world, in Chris's world of unicorns and rainbows, if I'm in my initialization state, my bot's always going to go to the end. It encounters a catch in my initialization state. It's our general rule. It's part of our developer standards here where I work. If I'm in the process state, I may not want that bot to go to the end state. I may do something different. But for each of these exceptions, you're going to tell the bot to do, even if you have 30 of these, you're going to tell each of the bot what to do in any of these situations. And now you'll see your finally. Now finally is going to happen whether the bot encounters an exception or not. Okay. If the bot does its try and there's no exception, it's going to go to finally. Okay. If the bot encounters try and it hits an exception, the bot's going to go to finally. What we typically do in finally is we're going to have the bot delete files that it created as part of that process, clean up some things if we need things cleaned up, close some things if we need things closed, go back to a home page if we need the bot to go back to a home page. That's what the advantage of your finally. So in our world, in my world, we will typically not leave the finally empty. There will be some instances where you really don't have a finally, especially in your initialization state. But if it's in the process state, we always give the bot, if you hit an error, or if you don't do this, I want you to go and do this finally step, right? And again, I'm talking fast, so I apologize if I'm losing you. And as you all know, if you have questions, even though Diana's very polite, just hit me up and I will answer those, even though she hates that. All right, let's talk about working in a UI. Let me pull up. We're going to work with this web page here with my little Chris code sandbox. And I always maintain just a code sandbox because I always test different things and different ideas in my sandbox. One thing I want to encourage you before we go further into these, I want to encourage you to avoid working with this guy. You should probably always do a flow chart or a state machine. You should always have everything in an RE framework or a modified linear framework RE framework. But I always avoid using a sequential, because if you have a lot of decisions that you have to have the bot make, you're going to end up getting yourself into some nested if statements. That's an if within an if within an if. If this doesn't happen, then this. If this doesn't happen, then this. It's all going to be in one if statement. And that's going to eventually cause you some faults in your automation, because you're going to end up confusing the code. So I will tell you, in my world, we don't use sequence in my COE. We will always put something in a flowchart, even if it's a small piece. We put something in the flowchart so we can use a flow decision instead of nested ifs. All right. So we're going to let's talk about element exists. If element exists is simply a simple Boolean. And here you can see I'm looking for this guy. So learning plans is going to show up on the page for learning plans. Unless UiPath comes up one day and calls it learning plans 1, it's going to say learning plans. And I'm just going to set that up as a simple Boolean. This is going to be kind of hard on one screen, guys, so you're going to have to forgive me. All right. So in my selector, you can see my learning plans. Okay. So let's talk about making robust selectors, and we'll go a little bit deeper into this as well. First, you're going to see the title. Okay. Now, let's say UiPath one day decided to change this from roles in RPA to developer roles in RPA. I tend to asterisk out a lot of my title pages, or just take them out completely and just have my Chrome exe. Because if you think about it, if you've got your bot set up best practice in your organization, even if you're operating on one screen, now citizen development may be a little bit different, but let's say your bot's operating in a server environment, it's RDPing into the server, it's only going to have one Chrome session open at a time. You may have different tabs, but it's going to have one Chrome session. So I will a lot of times just take out my title when I bring in my browser. It's just going to be in Chrome. It's going to be interacting with Chrome, and whatever Chrome is showing, it's going to find. And then that way I don't have to worry about the title changing, because I don't own UiPath. Okay? I don't work for UiPath. I don't have any control over what UiPath's third-party system is going to bring the next day to my organization. So I try and take out as much that's proprietary to UiPath as possible. And then you'll see this little guy here, visible inner text. And you're going to learn very quickly not to use, I would recommend, I'm not going to say you shouldn't, but I would avoid using visible inner text, because in some systems, especially if you're working with an ERP system, you're going to find some characters in there that aren't showing on your screen. Okay? I do not use visible or inner text in my organization. We will use things like inner text, a name. We will avoid things like class. Isleaf just means if it has a parent-to-child relationship to anything. If it's a 1, it's a simple relationship. If it's a 0, it's a more combined relationship. You will find very few people are going to use Isleaf. Parent class I will avoid, because we're just getting too far up there. One thing that I do avoid all the time, or most often, is to be class. But if I take class out here, you're going to see it's going to index me. Okay. We don't typically recommend you do an IDX and index above 1 or 2. And that's just counting where that placement is on your screen. And you can't see that if you think about a web page. A web page is just a large grid. And for those of you who built web pages before, like I have, it's just a large grid. And it's just counting where it's at. So we want to avoid an index. So we will go ahead and put class back in there, because there's really nothing else I want to use. I'm not going to use a CSS selector. I know how to use CSS selectors, but CSS selectors will change quite often depending on the web page, and depending on the volume of things that are happening in your application, your CSS selector will change. So I avoid using that as well. All right. When I'm doing that, I'm just going to make a simple Boolean statement. I'm going to put that in a if else. If Boolean, then do this. If not, do this. Okay. I can put that in a flow decision as well. If Boolean as a conditional statement in my flow decision. If Boolean this, go to this branch. If not, go to this branch. Okay. Let's talk about navigate to. This is where I was talking about, instead of having our bot go in here and click around these hyperlinks and things like that, we just navigate to. And you can see that UiPath, and you will have to you have to really evaluate your web pages or this applications you're working in to make sure that URL for that page you're going on stays static. So SAP is really good about it. If you navigate to an SAP or Blackline, Lucernix, or Coupa or Ariba, that URL, if you're going to even if you're going to an invoice, you can type that invoice into your navigate to, and it'll take you to that invoice number, whatever it might be. So navigate to is a really good tool to use instead of clicking around an application, because if you're clicking around an application, your chances of your selectors not working the next time are going to be higher. So we use navigate to. So I had the bot go in, it's clicking on certification. The bot's only going to take this URL address and take me here. Okay. I didn't have to click on anything to get there. It's just taking me. Okay. So we want to use navigate to. Let me pull up the right one because I haven't lost it. We want to use navigate tos where possible instead of doing clicks and things like that. We want to get it. We don't want to go through 15 web pages to get to the page we want. We want to navigate to it directly if we're able to do that. And if that web page doesn't have a character in the URL that changes from instance to instance, then you can use navigate to. Now, I will tell you, a lot of ERP systems, or some, I shouldn't say a lot, Oracle's good about this. They want, or JD Edwards, they want to count the number of times a web page is hit. So you will have a variable character in that, and you won't be able to use navigate to necessarily. All right. We're going to just do a click. We're going to look at some selectors. And some of this may be elementary for you, some of you, but some of it may not be. So I'm just kind of going through this. Let's talk about anchoring. Let's anchor your selector. So let's say I'm in my web page and I want to make sure, I want to scroll down and I want to do, I think we're looking here, System Developer Foundation. But now UiPath may change this around sometimes, right? So I want to anchor that to something. I want to make sure that the bot's going to find it each time. Now, this is really helpful if you're going into a web page, especially if you're going to a BOPI, and if you're going manually into a BOPI in SAP or something like that. They don't always, in SAP historically, especially if you're using Fiori, doesn't always have the best selectors. And UiPath and SAP are working on it. They're getting a lot better, but they don't always have the best selectors. So we do a lot of anchoring in those. And you can see, this is the selector I chose. It's a simple, I mean, it's complex. It's a simple selector because it's the one. And I'm anchoring that to this guy. I think I'm anchoring it to learning plans. Okay. Now, if we scroll up in our panel up here, we can find my anchor, right? Here's my anchor. You can see my anchor says learning plans. So I could choose that on my anchor so that if it's on learning plans and it hasn't changed, then it's going to find learning plans. Now, we have to be careful about this navigation up because in one instance, RPA System Developer Foundation may be fifth in the list, and next time UiPath may add new classes, it may be 7. So we want to make sure that we make this selector guy here as robust as possible, even if we're anchoring it, so that it doesn't necessarily, if I can wildcard this guy out, this nav up, I can wildcard that guy out, and that way I don't have to tell the bot to navigate anywhere. It's just going to start looking at the components of your selector to find where it needs to go, right? So if you have a very complicated, if you're trying to find a very complicated selector or it's variable and you're having some challenge with it, try anchoring your selector to get a more robust selector. All right. All right, let's go and let's talk about I must have a here, bear with me. I gotta dig through this and find out where I'm at. So hold on. Somewhere. I should close it real quick. Oh, there he is. I see him. Let me open it back up. All right, there we go. Oh, that's the article. That's not what I'm crashing here, so I go. Let's open it back up. Hopefully I didn't lose anything doing that. So hopefully we still have our sandbox there. And we do not. Okay. So let's just talk about some of the subject matters and we'll just dig in and we'll just go as we go. Since I lost my examples. All right. We're going to talk about should stops real quick. Because I think should stops are very important, especially if you're using Orchestrator. It's not going to work if you're not using Orchestrator, okay? If I have just a plain for each loop, I can throw what we call a should stop into my for each loop. And I'm going to put that first, okay? So the bots, and this is just a simple Boolean, and depending on how many I have, I could have stop 1, 2, whatever it is. And it's going to come across as a simple Boolean, okay? So this is how Orchestrator knows to, if you go into Orchestrator into your transactions or into your process, you just push stop the process. This is what the bot's looking for, is this should stop. If you don't have a should stop, the bot's not going to stop it. You would have to kill it, right? And killing is not as graceful as should stop, because should stop is going to finish the transaction it was on, and then it's going to stop gracefully. It's going to take it to the end state. A killing is just going to stop it where it's at, all right? And then you have a transaction item stuck in your orchestrator that says in progress. You may have to go back and reload it or things like that. But a should stop is a little bit different. It allows things to end gracefully. So I'm going to throw a should stop in there, and then I'm going to just throw in an if statement in there. And I will just say should stop 1. And then I'll tell the bot to stop, right? End my process, right? You can do that by throwing a BRE. I can throw in a business rule exception, because in my world, the BRE takes my automation to the end. And I would just put should stop 1, and that way I knew where it stopped, right? That's how I stop my automation, right? And then I can go on and do whatever else. If there's no should stop, I can go in here and do my process. So should stop is very important if you're doing, if you're like me, you have a lot of transactional data, you have a lot of transactions, you have bank recons, you have transaction audits, you have POS audits, you have sales audits. Should stop is a good way for me to be able to go into Orchestrator if I have something that's a little bit higher priority and my bots are chomping away at a queue, and I have something that comes in that's a higher priority, I can should stop. And I'll open up and I'll be able to start an automation and still have the integrity of my automation, the integrity of my server, and the integrity of my transaction data, right? Should stop. Wait for download. Let's talk about wait for download. So if you're like we talked about earlier, when you have a large file and you're downloading your large file and you don't know how long it's going to take, it may take 5 minutes one day, it may take 10 minutes next day, or if it's taken 30 minutes, you're running into persistency issues, things like that. You can do a wait for download,
And you're gonna, this monitored folder is gonna be where you're downloading this file to. All it is. You can put that in. We don't hard code addresses in our automations. We're gonna put that into a config location, and we're gonna bring that in through an argument into our automation because we use the framework. We don't even put that down here in a variable. We don't type it over here. Okay. We're going to put that into our config file in config, wherever it might be. And the file that we're going to be using, well, you've named the file in your code so you know what file it is, right? And you're telling the bot, I want you to look for this file. And if you've ever watched a download happen on your screen, you know that it starts most likely, it's going to start as, hold on. Sorry, I have someone that's going a little nuts here. One of my bots is tripping. Okay, you're going to, you can, if you've done it, you can see the file's gonna say something along this way. It's gonna say temp. Every file that's downloaded starts as a temp, right? A temp file. Sorry. Okay. Bot's yelling at me here. It's going to start as a temp file. You may even have a file in there that's going to have something along this lines in it. Like that. Okay. So this is going, if you're ignoring these characters, these extensions, these file extensions, you're just focusing on what the bot's supposed to be downloading. But this will wait for that to happen. Nothing after this is going to start until your file is downloaded. Okay. And this is better than coming in here and doing a delay of 10 minutes, right? You use a wait for download. It's going to be a lot cleaner. You won't have to be second guessing how long you're going to be, your file is going to take to download. And it's a very good tool, and it's going to help you avoid some errors, okay? Set focus. Let's talk about set focus. Set focus is going to work if your element is, if your element's on the screen. Set focus will not work if the element you're looking for is down here and can't be found on the screen, okay? Set focus is going to find what's here. So if you're saying, okay, I want to find Citizen Developer Foundation, instead of clicking around, I can set my focus. Oh, I need that to open. I can set my focus. This is hard on one screen, guys. Right there. Do my little, make my selectors robust, and my bot's going to find RPA Citizen Developer Foundation. I didn't have to click anywhere. Okay. When that page goes up, you're telling the bot, set my focus of the bot's keyboard on this, and that's where I want you to navigate to. Okay. This is really good to use if you have a list of things that you want the bot to dig through, and your list may be indexed. It may be one, and you get down to the list of the list on the name on the list, the place on the list you want to be is IDX 23. And you want to avoid that because of the higher number, so you can set focus and take the bot right there to that one link that you need. Okay. And then let's talk about retry scopes. I know, Diana, I think I'm running out of some time here. Retry scope.
Yeah, you're okay.
Am I okay? Good.
Yeah.
Retry scope. I can click on an element. I can wait for something to appear. I can wait for an element to exist or things like that. But if I put something in a retry scope, I can tell the bot how many, if I'm waiting to click, and let's say the UI element is not completely there, I can tell the bot, I can tell the bot how many times I want to retry until it's done. I can put my, let's say this is a click activity, and my condition would be an element appears, right? There's only certain things you can use in a retry scope. So I can click on this until an element exists, okay? And you can keep clicking on it until an element exists. Sometimes I use a retry scope if I'm trying to refresh a page, waiting for something to happen on the page that's only going to work with the refresh. For example, I'm waiting for a file on my application to say the file is now prepared to be downloaded or something along that lines. I'm looking for that element exists says ready to download. There may be some latency. I can re-click and tell the bot how many times to re-click to click that activity. And I can even have an interval. How many milliseconds do I want between the next click? And then when it finds that, then we can go on to the next, right? So retry scope is a good way to avoid system latency and working through system latency, because we all know systems have latency, right? I don't think anybody can ever avoid system latency, especially if you're working in an organization where you're on a monthly close cadence or a quarterly close cadence or a financial cadence of some sort. You've got some automations working in finance. Even if you're doing some warehouse management stuff or inventory management stuff like what we do, you still get out some system latency depending on the volume of business, because computers can only handle this so much, right? So retry scope is a good tool to use, helps avoid some issues or some exceptions or things coming into your automation because the bot can't find something. All right. What else now I want to talk about? Throws. Again, I don't use typically rethrows. I'll use a throw an error, throw an exception. You can throw a system exception. You can throw a business rule exception. If you remember correctly, system exception is going to do what in your RE framework? It's going to take and it's going to start. It's going to start and it's going to take and start your automation over. It's going to close things and start things over. If you throw a new business rule exception, however, remember, I don't know how many were on here last week. A new business rule exception will simply say, your data's bad. Something with that data doesn't follow the rules of the process. So I'm throwing a business rule exception. If you remember a business rule exception, if you're in a linear RE framework that's linear, that you've modified to be linear, it's going to take it to the end state. If you're in a typical RE framework, a transactional RE framework, it's going to fail that transaction. It's going to go up and get the next one from your transaction queue, if there are any left. If there are no more transactions left, your transactions queue is going to take your bot to the end state. I use a lot of business rule exception throws. And I do because if you're not a developer, and I'm sure many developers have realized this, if you're not a developer, people don't always understand the minutia you have to incorporate into your code for a bot. Every possible exception that you may have to think about. Okay, so what if the file's not here? What if the file's renamed? Or what if the file came through, but it's only part of the file? Or what if the file came through, there's nothing on it? What if the columns change? What if the headings change? So I use throws quite often. And another thing I don't do to avoid errors is I will not have the bot look for a column header name. Let's say you have an Excel download or something that you're ingesting into your bot, and you have a header that says invoice, and it says vendor, and then it says date, and then it says amount, and it says tax. I don't look for those headers. I'm going to look for the column numbers. Column 1, column 2, column 3. And then I'm going to have the bot tell me within those column numbers. It's going to create a log file. It's going to say, this is what's in column A1 or column A2 or B1, C1, and so on. And so that way, if something falls, if I've got a fault coming through and it says, hey, this was not correct, then I can see, well, the columns changed. And that just may be more analogy on my part. But my goal is to make sure, again, like I said, we deal with stores and we deal with store-facing things. And Jimmy John that comes in part-time for
10 hours a week on a weekend doesn't necessarily always know how detailed he may need to be. And so we kind of work backwards a little bit to give Jimmy John a little bit more flexibility to make a mistake and have that mistake caught into our automation, because your organizations may be different, but we have to be a little bit more encompassing in what I do in the organization I play in. All right, I talked a lot. We have 10 minutes left. Anybody have any questions? Or did I lose absolutely everybody? Like I said last time, I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing that no one has questions. Either I did a heck of a good job or I just put everybody to sleep.
Yeah, so feel free to take yourself off mute if you have any questions.
No?
No. Yeah, so
That
I
means I
did.
did a good job, Diana.
You did. So thank you everybody for attending tonight. Thank you, Chris, so much for presenting. If you guys do, I put my email in chat. If you do have any questions or topics, please let me know, reach out. And also there is a session next week, so I also put that in chat for you to sign up for. It'll be the last of the series. So thank you again for joining tonight.
Thanks, guys.